Prepare yourself for the horror I'm about to share with you. I'm not sure if this is the right place to tell a story like this, but I couldn't think of any other place to say it, and I just have to share it. I've told everyone about this, my family, neighbors, friends, random people on social media, but it still doesn't feel like enough. I can't explain it fully, but I feel this strange compulsion to warn as many people as possible about what happened to me. So here's the story. It was November 2019 when I wrote this. The story begins a long time ago. I'm talking about around 7 years ago. I can't remember the exact year right away, but let's say it was 2012, maybe 2013, but that's my best guess. At that time, I was in my mid-20s, had a stable job, and a girlfriend, who is now my fiancée. I never went to college, so I had been working for a while, and there wasn't much likelihood that my life would change drastically. So there was no reason for me to leave home, so I didn't. At that age, my girlfriend and I had just moved into my childhood home, the house that my parents generously passed down to me as my first home. It was a very old brick house that my father had actually inherited from his grandparents when he was about 40, so I intended to keep it in the family. The house had been renovated a few times, but you could still tell it was quite old. The bricks themselves made that clear. In our area, there are very few brick houses, so mine stands out like a sore thumb. I actually liked that. It made the house feel special. Speaking of our neighborhood, we live in a very wooded area, so the houses are pretty spread out. Our house is also the last lot on the street, which means instead of being bordered by forest on just one side, we're surrounded by forest on both sides. The forest behind our house is really vast, really vast. When we were kids, my brothers and I would often go exploring in it, but no matter how much we wandered aimlessly, we could never fully explore it. I'm sure some people would find that scary, but I've always loved the wilderness, so it was never an issue for me. Besides, I've always been the type to keep to myself, always have been, so living in solitude in my own space. The corner of the earth is quite fascinating. Anyway, my girlfriend and I had been living there for a few months when things started happening. It was winter, though I don't recall the exact month, just that there was snow on the ground. It was around 8 a.m. on a Sunday, the only day of the week I get to sleep in. As I got into my truck to treat myself to a cup of coffee, like I do every Sunday morning, I noticed something strange in the garage entrance, right next to my truck. There were footprints in the snow, or at least something that looked like them. At first, I thought maybe my girlfriend had woken up before me, and I hadn't heard her, and she had gone outside for some reason. But the more I looked around, the more I realized that couldn't be the case. The path went through our front yard, and past a gap in the fence along the side of the yard, meaning the footprints must have come from somewhere in the woods. On top of that, the path didn't lead near our house, so it couldn't have been made by my girlfriend. Standing there, feeling confused, the path didn't go around our house or lead up to any windows, it just led to the driver's side of my truck. That meant someone had walked directly from the woods to my truck, then immediately turned around and went right back into the forest. It was so strange. I asked my girlfriend about it later that day, but clearly she had nothing to do with it. I wish I could provide more details about that first time, but it's been so long, so that's what I remember. It must have been at least 2 winters later before the next thing happened. I clearly remember it was 2015 because that was the year my Seahawks team lost the Super Bowl to Tom Brady. That morning, I woke up and went out to my truck. I think it was a weekday, but I'm not totally sure. As soon as I stepped outside, I immediately sensed that something was very, very wrong. There were footprints everywhere. I'm talking about footprints in the driveway, near all the windows, around the edges of the house. The entire yard was covered in footprints. I'm a pretty calm person, so I wouldn't say anything. I started to panic, but I'd be lying if I said I was completely calm at that moment. I was already late for work, so I didn't have time to thoroughly check the footprints, but I didn't want to leave my girlfriend in a dangerous situation. I quickly ran around the house and yard to make sure no one was lurking around, but that was all I could do with the limited time I had. As I was driving out of the driveway, I texted my girlfriend about the situation, so she wouldn't panic. I finally got home early that day, mostly because the situation kept haunting me. When I got home, my girlfriend had noticed something shocking. As soon as I drove into the yard, she signaled for me to come over to the garden and pointed at a footprint, saying it had worried her all day. At first, I was confused, but then I realized what she was talking about. There were no shoe prints left. I felt like an idiot for not noticing that sooner. Someone had left those footprints and walked around without wearing shoes. I didn't know what to say anymore. Who would walk around barefoot in such freezing cold like this? My girlfriend suggested it could have been some kind of animal, but the footprints really looked like they belonged to 2 human feet. We went inside and called my dad, but he said he'd never experienced anything like this during all his years living in that house. He told me to grab the hunting rifle and try to track down whoever left the footprints. I really didn't want to do that, but I knew it was my responsibility. My girlfriend wanted to call the police, but I knew it would be pointless since we didn't have any evidence of a crime, and I didn't think trespassing alone would be enough to launch a search. I told her I'd call the police if I found anything in the woods, and she agreed. As I mentioned earlier, that forest felt like a world of its own, so I told myself I'd turn back as soon as the sun started setting. I slung my hunting rifle over my shoulder and headed out. I had been following the footprints for about 30 minutes when I noticed something really strange. Out of nowhere, the tracks split into 2 different paths. I had no idea which one to follow. Hell, I didn't even know that was possible. At first, I thought maybe whoever left the tracks had doubled back to confuse me, but then another unsettling thought hit me. Was there more than one person out here? The whole time, I had assumed I was tracking just one person. I hadn't even considered the possibility of more. That alone was enough to make me uneasy, though I wasn't entirely comfortable with the thought that I might be outnumbered out there. I stood still for a moment before finally deciding to turn back. It was starting to get dark, and as I made my way back, I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. I felt like I should have noticed if 2 people had been trying to walk in the same tracks. There's no way the second person could have done it perfectly without messing up at least once. Then another thought hit me. What if someone had walked backward from deep in the forest to make it look like there were 2 people the whole time? And of course, there was also the possibility that it really was just one person, carrying someone else on their back until they got too tired. I honestly didn't know which explanation was the scariest. That night, we called the police, but as I expected, they said there wasn't much they could do without clear evidence of a crime. I told my girlfriend I'd go back into the woods the next morning, but overnight, a heavy snowfall covered everything, erasing the footprints. She was obviously terrified, but there really wasn't anything we could do. Luckily, that was the last strange incident that winter. In fact, nothing happened for several years. I could even say we had completely put it out of our minds. A lot happened in the meantime. My girlfriend and I got engaged, and we were focused on other things. I wouldn't be writing this if the story ended there, but what I'm about to tell you happened less than a year ago, this past January. One morning, out of nowhere, I woke up to find footprints all over my property again, just like before. And just like that, all the memories came rushing back. My Ethan completely broke down in the bedroom, asking me if we would ever escape this nightmare. I didn't know what to say to her. Honestly, this time was even worse. There were footprints leading to my storage shed, and a bunch of my tools were missing. Who knows what else those people had done? I was beyond furious. I called my friend Theo, explained the situation, and asked for his help. He was a nature lover and a far more experienced hunter than I was, which was one of the reasons I asked for his help. He agreed and drove over to my place a few hours later. My Ethan was worried sick, but I promised her that Theo and I could handle it. We dressed warmly and got ready, knowing we might be out there for a while. The reason I wasn't worried about the darkness this time was that Theo had a very expensive thermal scope for his R0d, which would help us see in low-light conditions. I had never spent that much money on hunting gear, so I'd still be blind, but at least I felt a little more secure. Knowing that at least one of us would be able to see gave me some reassurance. I won't sugarcoat it. I was genuinely terrified as we headed out. At first, Theo and I chatted while walking, but after about 45 minutes, we mostly fell silent. The gravity of the situation seemed to hit us both at the same time. I remember praying to God that I hadn't dragged Theo into something truly awful. I'm not sure how long we kept walking after that, but eventually the footprints split into 2 separate trails again. We followed the left set for a while, but at some point, the tracks suddenly stopped. We headed back to the split, and Theo commented that whoever left these tracks really didn't want to be followed. I didn't want to think about it, so we kept following the footprints in silence. No joke, there were at least 3 more splits where we had to turn back, wasting precious daylight. I remember thinking how incredible it was that someone could walk backwards so perfectly that the footprints didn't look like they had been stepped on twice. I'll tell you, this is not normal at all. 1. Positive thing Theo pointed out to me was that the stops might mean we're tracking just one person. Eventually, it started getting dark, and we were deep in the forest by then. I didn't recognize the surroundings anymore. The footprints didn't split for a long time after that, and Theo said the person we were tracking had probably given up on making stops. About 5 minutes later, the track started to get deeper and clearer. We were getting close. At one point, a new set of footprints appeared right next to the original ones. Theo cursed under his breath, whispering that he was wrong, and we might be tracking 2 people. The sun was nearly gone by then, so Theo occasionally checked his scope. The snow gave me some visibility, but to be honest, I probably would have turned back if it hadn't been for Theo's scope. We walked in absolute silence, and suddenly I felt Theo's hand press against my chest, signaling me to stop. I looked at him, and he was staring straight ahead through his scope. I couldn't see what he was looking at, so I just kept my eyes on him. He looked like he was holding his breath. I had never seen him stand so still. After about 20 seconds, he slowly moved to the nearest tree and crouched down. I followed his lead without asking why. Then he looked through the scope again, and I saw his hand start to shake slightly. Another 20 seconds of complete silence. I was dying from suspense, so I gently tapped his shoulder. He lowered the rifle and silently handed it to me. I looked through the scope and had to fight to suppress a scream. There were 4 figures huddled together in the snow. At first, I thought they were bears, but I quickly realized they weren't. They were human. 2 of them were large and hunched over, while the other 2 were smaller. The smaller ones were clinging to a nearby tree, turning their heads wildly. They were eating something. I couldn't make out their faces or details. The thermal scope didn't allow me to see that, but I could see enough to know they were naked. It was the most terrifying thing I'd ever witnessed. Eventually, the larger ones lifted the smaller ones off the tree and placed them on their shoulders. Then they started moving deeper into the forest. Theo and I sat under that tree, feeling like we were there for an hour. We didn't dare move until we were sure there was no way those creatures could hear us. When we returned home, hours later, I was surprised to find my girlfriend still awake. She said she couldn't sleep, worrying about me being out there, and asked what we had found. I told her with the bare minimum details, but she was still terrified. We called the police that night, and they said they would search the woods the next morning. Theo agreed to stay overnight, so we could assist the police in the search. The next morning, the police searched the woods with our help, but had to call it off after a few hours because the footprints were partially covered. My girlfriend insisted that they continue searching, but they said they couldn't organize a large search just because of a few missing tools. I don't blame them, but it didn't feel like closure. Theo and I knew what we had seen, and with winter approaching, both my girlfriend and I were worried that those people would come back. We were seriously considering moving, but we hadn't started planning that yet. I didn't know what to think. As I mentioned before, I've told everyone about what happened to us, but it's really stayed with us over the years. None of my neighbors have ever experienced anything like this, and it doesn't make sense to me. I don't understand why my house was targeted or what those people want. Some of my friends think they're harmless, but others have told me I'm in serious danger. I think I'll try to close off my yard from the forest, but I don't know what else to do beyond that. I hope we can move soon. Last summer, I decided to tackle a large part of the Pacific Crest Trail. I've always loved hiking, especially solo trips. My plan was pretty simple. Park at the end of the trail, take a bus to the trailhead, and hike back for over a week and a half. It seemed simple at the time, and the first few days went as smoothly as I had hoped. The trail was just as I had hoped, with endless stretches of tall trees and winding paths cutting through peaceful landscapes. I'm pretty fit, so I didn't have to stop too often while hiking. Of course, I wouldn't hike in the dark, so each evening I had to set up camp to rest. I've always preferred to keep a low profile, especially when hiking alone, as it can attract attention. So, every evening I would camp a bit off the trail. I figured it was better that way, minimizing the chance of strangers stumbling upon my campsite. Until the 3rd night, everything had been completely normal, but what I'm about to share with you is the reason I decided to take an extended break from hiking or any outdoor exploration. I woke up in the middle of the night with a strange feeling that something was wrong. It was that kind of gut feeling you can't explain, but you know you shouldn't ignore. I looked around the tent, everything seemed normal inside, so I decided to step out and check the campsite. I grabbed my gun, took my flashlight, and unzipped the tent. There was no one out there, at least no one I could see. I went back into the tent and started checking my backpack, that's when I realized my wallet was missing. At first, I thought maybe I had just forgotten it outside the tent or buried it somewhere in my stuff, but after rummaging through everything, it was clear that someone had taken it. Personal information, cash, credit cards, all gone. How could this happen? Had someone broken into the tent just to steal one thing and left? It seemed unlikely, but the idea that I had simply forgotten it was very out of character for me. I reluctantly accepted the unfortunate conclusion that maybe I had lost it. However, things only got worse from there. In the following days, I started noticing more things were missing. Small items, things that seemed random, like a lighter, my Swiss Army knife, a few energy bars. I knew I hadn't just forgotten everything. Someone was stealing my stuff. A part of me didn't want to believe it, but by the fourth day, it was undeniable that I was being watched. There was no cell phone signal in this section of the trail, so I couldn't alert anyone about my situation. I remember thinking about turning back, but I could only save myself a few good days. There was no way I could walk in any direction without needing to sleep, but I didn't feel comfortable setting up my tent in that forest with someone watching me. It was a no-win situation. I kept calm and reminded myself there was a reason I brought my gun out there. Then it suddenly hit me, why didn't they take my gun? It seemed like they were intentionally toying with me. That night, I sealed the tent from the inside, hoping it would stop them from getting in if they came back. I tried to stay awake all night, but eventually, I fell asleep from sheer exhaustion. My plan worked because when I woke up the next morning, there was no sign anyone had entered my tent. But by then, confusion had completely taken over me. The isolation began to mess with my mind, and every step I took felt like agony. I've never been anxious or experienced anything like it, but let me tell you, I've never felt worse in my life than I did in the following days. Just imagine being in my shoes, having no choice but to keep walking, knowing someone is lurking not far behind. The feeling of anxiety stretched on, and I began to lose control. I can't explain why or how, but my mind started playing tricks on me. The rustling in the bushes turned out to be nothing. A shadow flickered at the edge of my sight and vanished the moment I turned my head. The hallucinations got worse and worse. I remember most of them clearly, but the most memorable was when I was walking and suddenly stepped into a puddle deep enough to my ankles, nearly tripping. I could actually hear the splash and feel the cold water soaking into my boots, but when I looked down, the ground was completely dry. I stood there in utter shock. It was so real that I couldn't do anything but keep walking along the trail. Even though the days were bad, the nights were always worse. I secured my tent tightly and slept next to my gun, but nothing helped erase the anxiety. After a while, I had to splash cold water on my face to calm myself down. The hallucinations mostly faded after that. I didn't know what I would do if they kept going. The next night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps circling around my camp. I quietly grabbed my gun, ready to face anyone out there, but my body was completely frozen in fear. Eventually, the footsteps faded into the woods, but nothing in this world could make me sleep again after that. As soon as the sun rose, I packed up my camp hurriedly, my hands shaking so much I couldn't even tie the gear down. I couldn't stay there for another night. I was almost there, just about a day and a quarter's walk from my car, maybe less if I moved quickly. I decided I wouldn't stop to sleep that night, but would walk through the night to get off that terrifying trail as fast as possible. I walked for hours, as fast as my body would allow. As the sun began to set, I gritted my teeth and kept going, instead of setting up camp, not even making it in time to set up before it got dark. I was close, maybe just 2 hours from the end. I kept walking, flashlight in one hand and rifle in the other. I began to doubt my decision. I had never walked in the dark before, and wasn't prepared for how difficult it would be. That alone was terrifying enough. I kept going, trying to keep my breathing steady. About an hour passed, and I was getting closer, when I heard footsteps somewhere behind me. I turned around and shined my flashlight, and to my horror, I saw a figure hiding behind a tree. The adrenaline surged, and I aimed the gun at the tree. I demanded that they come out, my voice loud. The figure stepped out, definitely a person, but when I tell you that it was the most grotesque thing I've ever seen, I'm not exaggerating. Words cannot describe what I was looking at. He was wearing only a pair of my shorts, which I didn't even realize had gone missing. His skin was scratched in several places, and his face was covered in hair. He started walking toward me, and despite the gun pointed at him, before I could think, I fired a warning shot right next to him. He flinched at the sound and immediately retreated, running quickly into the woods. I was still in shock, not wasting another second. I turned and ran as fast as I could. When I got out of the woods, I locked my car and called the police. When they arrived, they told me I shouldn't stay for long. I didn't need to hear it a second time, so that night I left. The craziest part of the whole ordeal, to me, were the hallucinations. I never thought such vivid hallucinations could occur. It will be a long time before I go hiking again, and I can confidently say that when I do, I won't be going alone. I advise anyone planning to hike the Pacific Crest Trail to be extremely careful and to bring weapons. This experience is something I still think about often. I apologize in advance if I get any details wrong in the story I'm about to tell. This is a story my best friend has told many times from many years ago. It's one of those stories so disturbing that you can't shake it off, even after hearing it multiple times. My friend's father was a logger, specifically a chainsaw operator. For those who don't know, a chainsaw is a huge machine capable of cutting down large trees and slicing them into specific sections. His job required long hours, often working alone in the deep, remote forests of the Pacific Northwest. The way his logging crew worked was that he was paid based on the number of trees felled rather than the hours worked, so he often pushed himself to work 16 to 20 hours a day to get the job done as quickly as possible. After he and his co-workers completed their part of the job, the rest of the team would come in to clean up the felled trees and transport them to the mill. While he worked alone about half the time, the other half he worked with his friend Lucas, another chainsaw operator. They used radios to communicate, especially when working at opposite ends of the same site. Several years ago, my friend's father and Lucas were assigned a job at a remote location on a mountain. It took the company over 3 weeks just to clear a road wide enough for trucks and equipment to reach the site. When they started their work, they were assigned to a part of the mountain that was extremely remote. They had been working for 10 days and were making good progress when they began hearing strange sounds through the radio. At first, the voices were very faint, just gentle static-filled whispers with no meaning. They tried changing channels, but no matter what they did, the voices persisted. Anyone who has used a regular radio knows that this is very strange. There shouldn't be anyone following you when you switch channels. As they moved further up the mountain, the voices began to become clearer. They couldn't make out the entire conversation, but based on what they could hear, both of them agreed that the tone of the voices felt unusual. My friend's father said that the sound seemed almost normal at times, but the content was completely incomprehensible. They also began to find strange signs that someone had been there before them, such as random containers, footprints in the dirt, and small makeshift camps. As I mentioned earlier, they were in a place so remote it was nearly inaccessible, so these discoveries really scared them. No one should be there. One day, Lucas discovered a tent hidden off a trail and called my friend's father over. They decided to investigate inside and found only a sleeping bag and a duffel bag full of unimaginable horrifying things, several pairs of children's underwear, tape, ropes, and crude drawings of abused children. They even found pictures of a fresh apple, indicating that its owner had been there recently. Lucas wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but my friend's father, who was always focused on the task, insisted that they had to finish the job. They agreed to only use the radio in case of emergency and continued working. That night, they sat in the camper truck, unable to shake the overwhelming sense of fear. The radio crackled again, and this time they could clearly hear part of a conversation between two men. They were talking about ordinary things like gathering water and firewood, but they realized these people might be connected to the tent, which made my friend's father feel terrified. Lucas wasn't as affected, but my friend's father completely lost his composure. The next night, my friend's father decided to confront them when he heard the men talking about gathering brush for kindling. He took the radio and demanded to know who they were and what they were doing there. The radio went silent immediately, and the men didn't answer. That silence was even more chilling than the previous conversations. Lucas was angry that my friend's father had revealed their presence, and the two had a brief argument before deciding to escalate the situation the next day. He took the radio and demanded to know who they were and what they were doing there. The radio went silent immediately, and the men didn't answer. That silence was even more chilling than the previous conversations. Lucas was angry that my friend's father had revealed their presence, and the two had a brief argument before deciding to escalate the situation the next day. The door creaked open, but not the door of their camper, which was pushed inward. The camper was higher off the ground and didn't have a ladder or steps to climb. Then came the long, deliberate scratching sounds along the vehicle's door. For minutes of tense silence passed. Finally, my friend's father nodded to Lucas, signaling that he was going to check it out. He moved silently toward the door, his hand gripping a trembling flashlight. As he got close to the door, it suddenly opened, and he was struck in the face with a knife. The pain, like a shock, left him dazed, and he stumbled out of the camper, falling hard to the ground. Before he could recover, a man was on top of him, pressing the knife to his throat. Another man appeared, kicking him in the head repeatedly. Without hesitation, Lucas rushed out of the camper and attacked the man with the knife. The second man quickly ran into the darkness, and the one Lucas had just attacked got up and chased after him. They disappeared into the woods. Lucas helped my friend's father back to the vehicle, and they drove for 2 hours to the nearest hospital. It was bad. His face was covered in blood, and there was a cut running across his eye. The severe pain permanently damaged his vision. They reported the attack to the police, but nothing came of it. 2 weeks later, when the rest of the logging crew finished the job, one of their co-workers was found bound, gagged, raped, and murdered in a ditch. No one was arrested for the crime. To this day, my friend's father still deals with PTSD, his right eye with a distorted pupil constantly reminding him of that night. I'm sure he hasn't had a good night's sleep since then. I was terrified of deep forests for a long time, mostly because of my friend's father's experience. I haven't heard from my friend or her father in years, so I just hope they're okay.